This study has been kind of depressing the last couple of weeks because we've been talking about just the absolute worst time in church history. We've been talking about the Crusades and the Inquisition and indulgences, and that period of 1200 to 1500 was the absolute worst time in church history. But as is often the case in God's workings, when there is a really terrible time, very often that's leading into a time when God does his greatest work. I used to, when I was sitting in church as a little kid and I was feeling bored or whatever, my dad was a good preacher, but still sometimes I'd get bored, I would read Judges 17 through 21, which is basically like the worst part of the Bible. I mean, it's horrible, and the stories are horrible. If you made a movie out of Judges 17 through 21, it would have to be rated R or maybe worse. It's just, the stories are just, they're not X-rated. I don't mean that. They're violent and they're disgusting, and they're just really, the people are just terrible. It's the end of the period of the Judges, and it's terrible. And at the end of that, you come to, after the book of Ruth, you come to the beginning of the book of Samuel, and a lady named Hannah is crying in the temple, can't have children, and calls out to God, and God gives her a son named Samuel. She gives that son to God, and God restores Israel, and he anoints first of all Saul and then David. And Israel reaches the pinnacle of its history within, 50 or 75 years. In other words, this low point at the end of the book of Judges, where you think, oh, this nation must be just about to go under, their high point is 100 years later. The pinnacle under David, God was preparing them for something great. And this absolute low point that took place, which was, I wasn't exaggerating how really awful that it was. It really was terrible. But it was leading up to God restoring the church. Now, I of course, originally wanted to do this in 1 week, the Reformation. It's going to take me at least 2. We'll see if I can get it done in 2 weeks, I think. Hopefully 2 weeks. But the Reformation was it's actually a very brutal time period because of the resistance of the church, because of the way the church, at least for some reason, it's always hard to get that first slide. There we go. The early reformers, and we're gonna go through a list of probably 8 or 10 key names. But the early reformers did not want to divide the church. In other words, they all wanted to stay Catholic. They just wanted to reform the church. But the church, while they might have admitted that they knew they needed change, the powers that the people that had power, the elite power people, they didn't want to change because they had power. They were making money, and that shouldn't, in the church, that shouldn't have been an issue. But it was, and so they resisted the change that needed to be made. Division often results when people are trying to make changes, and the people that have power say, no, we don't want the changes. We're not going to allow the changes. And so the people in power resist the change, and they don't want to give up their power and control, and so there gets to be this tug of war, and that's what happens. So the first main character here, and we're going to spend more time on him than any of the others, the first main character here is a young man named Martin Luther. Born in 1483, died in 1546. Now, I don't know how well you can can see this map. Let me come around to the other side. Sorry, I'll block the camera out here. I'm kind of like a total eclipse here. But, he was a German. This is a map of how things, the green areas are the areas that stayed Catholic. The yellow areas are the ones that turned sort of, I guess that's more of a cream color. I think those are the ones that turned Lutheran. The pinkish areas went more Calvinist, followed John Calvin. And then, of course, England up here was Anglican. And this is all more post-Reformation. But he was in the German states, and the countries weren't like they are today. And he's up there in Wittenberg. You'll see the star up here. He's up here in Wittenberg, at least at first. He became a monk. At least the story I read was because he saw a guy killed by lightning. He saw a guy struck by lightning. But he had this sense of the fear of the wrath of God. He always had this sense. And he would go to confession, and they said he would spend like sometimes 6 hours a day in confession because he had this overwhelming sense of God's holiness and his own sin. Just this overwhelming, he could never get rid of this sense that he was guilty before God. And so, there's these two, I don't want to say competing, but sort of competing characteristics of God. God is holy, which means that he is righteous, and our sin is an offense against him, but he's also loving. And these are balanced in Scripture. He only had hold of one side of that, the holiness of God. So he had this intense sense of sin. It's stated that at one point someone, I think, asked him, "Do you love God?" And he said, "Love God, I hate him." Because he just had this overwhelming sense that God was going to judge him, that God was going to get him. So he had this fear of God. I think he was somewhat, if you ever read any of Martin Luther, he was crass. There's a thing, I don't know if it's still online or not, called the Lutheran Insulter. It's one of the most, if it's not there anymore, it's a shame, because it was one of the most hilarious websites there was, where you could just hit the Lutheran Insulter and it would bring up something that Luther said, insulting someone else. And then you could hit it again and it would bring up another insult that he gave when he was a Christian leader. And he would say things about other people. You would not have him as a preacher here, because he said he was a little bit, he had that sort of German sense of earthy speech, shall we say. And you see this all the way through. But he just had this deep sense. So they sent him to Wittenberg to study under another man named Staupitz. I guess that's how you say that. My German isn't real good. And he began to wonder, how can a sinful man, please a righteous God? And he began to study under Staupitz, and he came to this verse that changed the course of European history. At first, he was struck by the first line here, the righteousness of God. And that was what had always struck him, was the righteousness of God. God is righteous and we're not. And so what do? And then finally, he came to the last part of it. The gospel reveals a righteousness from God. How do we attain God's righteousness? How do we get there? How do we reach up to the righteousness of God? And then he saw that it was a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And this changed his life when he began to grasp this. And it changed the course of history when this nobody German monk finally grasped this truth. He wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, he was just this German monk studying in this little German town, and all of a sudden he began to get a hold of this, that he did not have to, he was focusing on the righteousness of God, and in his despair he sees that the righteous will live by faith, and he realized, I don't have to find peace with God. God gives me peace. Peace finds me. It's by faith, by grace through faith. God gives it to me, and this was the foundation on which the entire Reformation was built. The idea that we don't work our way to God, that Christianity is not a system of rules and rituals and all of that by which we build our way towards God, but it is God giving us grace through Jesus Christ. That was what Paul taught, Peter taught, John taught. That was the foundation of biblical Christianity, and the church had departed from that. And he restored that fundamental foundational biblical truth. He rediscovered it after it had been largely forgotten for 1,000 or 1,200 years. The church had gotten away from that, and he restored that truth. Just the just will live by faith. And this key was the foundation of everything. And that turned everything around when he began to teach this. And when he began to teach this, he became a pastor in a little parish called Mainz, and it was just a flashpoint. And he began to teach this, and everywhere. Now, Luther, at least at first, never saw himself as anything but a Catholic monk trying to reform the Catholic Church. Later on, he was driven to, I don't think he never saw himself as founding a Lutheran church. At least, not at first. He was just reforming the Catholic Church. And so he was doing that. Comments or questions here? You guys have been notably silent. But this is really one of the turning points in history, European history especially, when all of a sudden Luther began to teach that which was the fundamental truth of God's kingdom and of the New Testament church, and he began to restore that. So, Jenny.
Well, didn't the Catholic Church say that you had to pay money to be absolved of sins at that time?
Okay.
And there were things that they did, like go up steps on their knees or something.
Can I get on to my next point here, which is that exactly?
And then I'll be quiet.
Well, no, the point. Yeah, that's the next point. So.
All that stuff when he started teaching.
Yeah, Jenny, stop reading my notes.
No, I just happen to know a few things.
No, Luther was pastoring in Mainz, I don't know how to pronounce these words. And there was a man there who visited, a peddler, if you will, named Tetzel or Teitzel. There may be an EI in that. T-E-I, I'm not sure exactly how that name is spelled. Sometimes these names are spelled and differently and pronounced differently. But he came to visit in Mainz. In Mainz, and he was selling indulgences because the Catholic Church was trying to pay off St. Peter's Basilica, and it's still around today. It's a beautiful church. He was trying to pay it off. And so he was helping, and he got to keep about, as I read, he got to keep about half of what, if he sold indulgences, he got to keep half of what he sold. So there was an old line, and I don't know, this is the line that the jingle that supposedly was passed along. When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. In other words, if you're, they believe that most people, when they die, they go to purgatory, neither to heaven or hell, but to purgatory to pay off their debt. And so if you will buy indulgences, you can pay your you know, you can pay. My father is in purgatory. If I buy an indulgence, I'm buying his way straight to heaven. And so he was going around and doing that. He was going around he was going around selling these indulgences, and people were buying their way out. Well, Luther was enraged now that he had found the just shall live by faith. And by the way, I am way oversimplifying this. This took place over years, and I'm way oversimplifying it, but these are the high points here. Luther was enraged by Tetzel, peddling forgiveness, cheapening the grace of God. And so he challenges him to a debate. He wants to debate Tetzel. And so what he does is he writes down 95 points that he wants. It's going to be a short debate. He writes down 95 points that they're going to debate, or 95 theses for the debate. And then on October 31st, while he's out trick-or-treating, on October 31st of 1517, he nails, and some say he didn't actually nail them to the door, just posted them there where notices were kept, and there's some debate about the facts, but he put these theses on the door at Wittenberg, and then they were also published and circulated against many practices in the church at the time that he considered to be impure, but primarily against the selling of indulgences. That was the primary thing that was considered to be evil. And this was really the flashpoint of the Reformation. And this was where it really went forward, and it spread primarily in Germany, but it spread elsewhere. And so this takes us to the diet of worms. Ever heard of the diet? Actually, the diet of worms, of course, because the pronunciation. I'll show you where Worms is. A diet is that has nothing to do with anything you eat. A diet was an imperial council. The governmental authorities called him on the carpet, and this was in a town called Worms. Worms is the way it's spelled, but Worms is the way it's pronounced, I guess. And he was called there, and the Catholic Church, under the authority of the government, the local government, was demanding that he recant all of these things, because in these intervening years, it had spread widely. At first, the Pope just made fun of him, and all the College of Cardinals, they just made fun of him and said he was this guy. They called him a drunken cardinal. Said when he sobers up, he'll say differently, and then by now they realized that that he was causing trouble, and he refused to recant. Supposedly, he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Once again, whether he actually said those words or not, we don't know. But he had the help of one of the local governmental guys who either hid him or maybe even kidnapped him to save him from. He expected to die when he went to the because they put people to death. That was a pretty serious thing. And so he was hidden by this local German ruler. Now here's Worms. Wittenberg is up here, and then they brought him down here to Worms. And he was hidden for months. I think something like most of a year. He had to stay in hiding. Eventually, he was released, and he was able to continue his work. Not long after he was released, he got married to a lady named Catherine von Bora. And when he talked about his wife, this is where you can see his kind of sense of humor. He said he married her because she was far less objectionable than other women. She had far fewer bad qualities than other women. But he really came to love her. They had 6 children together, and then they adopted 4 others, so they had a total of, yes?
Did he not translate the Bible into the common language?
Yeah, and he did translate in 1522. He released a translation, and that had a big effect. That came later, but that was also a very important part of his work. So, yeah, and so he was in history one of the most important people. Fascinating man. Prone to deep depression, rages, and yet also one of the world's most important figures. The next guy, and I'm going to take the rest of these guys a lot less time with some of them. The next guy was Ulrich Zwingli. My mom and dad went to, they served for 6 months at International Baptist Church in Zurich, Switzerland, back a few years ago, and his church is still there. It's a museum now. And he said it's sad when you think of all these great men from back then, and now their churches are museums and nobody worships there anymore. But Ulrich Zwingli, this is where his church is, where Zurich is down here in Switzerland. He followed much of Luther's teaching and led his church to defy the church. Followed a lot of Luther's protests, and they met a few years later, and they were going to try to unite. They thought they'd be more effective if they united. And this is interesting theology. They met in Marburg. I don't really know where Marburg is. I didn't look to see where that was, but they met in Marburg to seek to join forces. And they stumbled over the presence of Christ at the Lord's Supper. That was the thing that kept them apart. They agreed on most everything. The just shall live by faith, all of that. They both rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, that the elements of the Lord's Supper somehow actually become the body and blood of Christ. Luther believed that Christ's presence somehow literally conveys grace during communion and mixes with the elements somehow in a way that actually conveys the grace of God. I don't really, being a Baptist all my life, I don't really understand transubstantiation and consubstantiation well enough to explain it very well. But he sort of took a moderating position between transubstantiation and the more the position that the Protestants eventually grew to hold. Zwingli took a position more like we hold, that Christ's presence is symbolic, that the Lord's Supper symbolizes the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, but doesn't actually doesn't actually have the body, and it's a symbol of it. And so they realized, after talking for several days, they realized that it wasn't going to work. They couldn't unite, but they also didn't condemn each other, which was fairly unique in those days, because they tended, if they had any small differences, they tended to say, well, you need to be burned at the stake, you need to die. And then came the third great, they're called the Magisterial Reformers. And I'm not sure exactly why the term Magisterial Reformers. I think it's because, I think it has to do with the fact that they combine with the government. I believe that's what Magisterial Reformer has to do with, although I'm not real sure of that. I should probably look that up. But here is John Calvin. John Calvin, who was a young man. He was, when he wasn't even born when Luther became a monk. He was born in 1509. Didn't live to be very old. very intense, brilliant man, very intense. He was actually born in France. I'm not even sure what part of France, but he was born in France. And then eventually ended up in Geneva, Switzerland. He was a humanist lawyer, a French humanist lawyer, and managed to offend, he was Catholic, managed to offend the government and the church with some of his teachings, and so he ended up fleeing because, again, remember it was the time of the Inquisition and all that, and when you offended people, it was a threat to your health, so he ended up fleeing, and he was on his way through Geneva, and they kind of prevailed on him to stay there. He eventually became a Christian and a Protestant, settled in Geneva, and actually before he got to Geneva, he wrote the first volume of Institutes of the Christian Religion, and eventually wrote, I think eventually there were 4 volumes of it, at least the set I had was 4 volumes, I believe, and developed the system of theology that we now know of as Calvinism. Although there are some who argue that some of modern day Calvinism has been developed and doesn't completely derive from John Calvin. While he was in Geneva, he offended some of the local rulers, and they chased him out. They chased him out of Geneva, and then they later asked him to come back. They needed him to confront something, and so they asked him to come back. And when he came back, what he did was he confronted the town council, and he basically took over and became the de facto ruler. He kind of became the Pope of Geneva, although they didn't call him that. And so he became the de facto leader. And I'll probably end on this because this is where I think this is really an interesting aspect, and it became a real divisive thing. All 3 major leaders of the Reformation, Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, continue to believe that the government should enforce church law. They believe that the church and the government should be together. In Geneva, there was a man named Michael Servetus. He denied the Trinity. They brought him into court. His crime was denying the Trinity. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't commit any crimes. He didn't steal anything. He denied the Trinity. They put him to death. They burned him at the stake for denying the Trinity. Now, here's where we get into, we go back to Zurich. This is under Zwingli's authority. A man named Felix Mons. He questioned certain, now we'll study him more, he's a pretty important figure. Felix Mons questioned certain aspects of the Lord's Supper. Specifically, why do we do communion in Latin? Why not do it in the language that people speak? When Jesus did the Lord's Supper, he did it in the language those people spoke. He probably did it in Aramaic. That's the language they spoke. Why don't we do the Lord's Supper in the language these people speak? And so Zwingli referred the issue to the town council to talk about it. And Mans is like, why are we going to the government to settle an issue like this? Why are we asking the government? We should be going to the Bible to settle an issue like that. By this time, there were more Bibles available, and he said, well, why are we going to the Bible? Why are we going to the government to settle an issue that ought to be settled by Scripture. He was one of the founders of a group that came to be known as the Swiss Brethren, Swiss Brothers. And he's like, why are we settling issues? Why are we going to the local government and asking them to arbitrate an issue that we ought to just study Scripture and ask what the Bible says? And then they ended up putting him to death over a different issue. He got his Bible out, and I'm getting ahead of myself, we'll get to this next week, but he's got his Bible out and he said, nowhere in the Bible does it talk about baptizing babies. We should stop doing that. We should baptize believers. And so they threw him in the cold, icy river and said, here, get baptized. And he was that's what they did. They eventually baptized about 10,000 Anabaptists. Not all were thrown in rivers, but that was the main way that they killed Anabaptists in this humongous persecution of Anabaptists. By the way, we don't descend from Anabaptists. Anabaptists are Mennonites, Amish, and groups like that are the descendants of the Anabaptists. But anyway, Jen, do you have a question?
Not a question. I just want to make a comment that the whole thing of Luther putting the Bible into the language that people could read the Bible for themselves and see that the church had false doctrine, and they would say, well, it's not in the Bible,
Yeah,
so
that was actually, and it was actually where Tyndale got his out first, and that's one of the later ones. But yeah, that Tyndale, Luther, all of them. That was one of the movements well, Wycliffe was one of the first ones. They put him to death, and Tyndale, they put him to death. Luther had his own power, so he could get away with it. They couldn't put him to death. There are really two strains of reformers, and the Magisterial Reformers and the other Reformers. I can't remember the names of. I'll have that next week. But the Reformed churches, the Magisterial Reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, or Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, really in chronological order, they, even today, they tend to look at the Reformers as the pinnacle of truth in church history. If Calvin said it, that's the center. They have they look back to the doctrinal confessions and the teachings of Calvin as almost that was when the truth of the church was restored. Other groups, first the Anabaptists, later Baptists, and other groups, look at the Reformers as an important step in the history of the church in restoring sound doctrine. And what we think, and it's my view, is that the Reformers restored the doctrine of salvation and certain other doctrines, but what they did was they kept too many of the unbiblical practices of the church, and they stopped too soon. They kept the relationship of the church and government. They kept, infant baptism and a lot of other unbiblical practices. And so they restored important biblical doctrines, but they didn't go far enough. And so these other groups, like the Swiss Brothers and other groups that we're going to see, the Anabaptists, and later on, the Baptists that we descend from actually came out of, and some of the denominational trees, they disagree whether we came out of the Calvinist groups, or more likely, we actually came out of the Anglicans as a dissenting group out of the Anglicans. But either way, we are a group that has seen that the Reformers, we appreciate the reforms that they made, but they stopped too soon. And they needed to reform worship practices. get rid of all of the icons and the worship and all of that and keep reforming. So that's just sort of a philosophical strand. The history of the church is constant reformation, and it didn't reach a pinnacle in the 1500s. It just took an important step. That's kind of my philosophy. And so that's the two different viewpoints of when you look at the Reformed Lutheran churches, obviously look at Luther. The Reformed churches look at Calvin. That's Reformed and Presbyterian, and they look at Zwingli to a certain extent. But they look back and say that was the pinnacle, and they judge their truth whether it's true to those guys. And we would say, not just we, but a lot of others would say, those were a good starting point. We need to keep moving from that point and continue to refine biblical doctrine and restore that 1500s were not the pinnacle, that the New Testament church is the pinnacle, and there's a lot of reforming still to be done. So here's Felix Mons before he was baptized. By the way, the Swiss brethren did not baptize by immersion. They baptized. They did not restore immersion. That came later. But I'm done. Questions or comments? You all were unusually non-talkative tonight.
I thought I interrupted you rather regularly.
You interrupted me a few times. But,